one of the leading innovators when it comes to the world of the internet, at least for the past 20 years. His research has helped us better understand the planet that we live in through his analysis of some of the largest data sets and computing systems on our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, you're very much going to enjoy this next Stratcom talk, the first of this summit. It's called Reimagining the World Through Data. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together in welcoming to the stage Dr. Kalev Litaru. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's truly an honor to be here today with all of you. There we go, perfect. So this image really summarizes the focus of my work, which is about how we can combine massive data, massive computing power, and new technologies like AI and new forms of analytics to try to understand the planet around us, to take the deluge of daily information and harness that in a way that it goes from being petabytes on disks and in networks around the world to insights that allow you to make actionable decisions, whether that is supporting policy decisions, or whether that is influencing narratives and communication, whether that is putting forward narratives or countering narratives, such as during a pandemic. And this image, by the way, is actually a real photograph. This is not a CG. There's actually a sphere that's hung from the ceiling. They project from around it. And that's one of my data sets on there. And again, it's that idea of massive data down to this tiny, simple display. And it's really about, imagine a day of news. So this image right here is the year of 2013, represented as a graph. All of the people, the organizations, the locations, all the events of the year, represented by their interconnections. Now, at first, you might see a graph like this, and you'd say, well, it's artwork, it's beautiful, but what does it tell me? Well, if we take a similar version of this from more recent years, we can drill further down. Remember, this is a network. We can drill further and further and further and further until we can start understanding the people, the organizations, the events, the emotions, the dreams and fears of the world around us, and the connections, the relationships that allow them to function. Now, in my particular work, I run a project called the GDEL project. It's a massive open data catalog, essentially, of the world. And this map shows all the locations that we monitor information from and about. Pretty much where there's people on Earth, we monitor from. And again, through the power of the news media. But this map is not the most interesting map. This one is. So, all too often in the world of data, most of the world of AI and analytics has been focused on English language material. Historically, political science, many of the data sets that existed were based on English, a few newspapers like the New York Times from the US. And scholars wondered, well, gee, how come we're not understanding the world around us? How come we're struggling to understand what's happening elsewhere around the world by only looking within our own news media? And so in the aftermath of the 2014 Ebola outbreak, one of the things that we found is that we had actually monitored a lot of the early coverage of that, but it was in French. And at the time period, we weren't able to process that. So what we did then is by the end of 2014, we began mass machine translating everything that we monitored in 65 languages from around the world. Now, fast forward to December 30th, 10 p.m. Eastern Time on December 30th, 2019. Now, because of this mass machine translation, a company in Canada called Blue Dot, their biosurveillance firm, was able to use our data to see the sudden surge of a SARS-like viral pneumonia of unknown origin, and send out a worldwide alert the following morning. So that ability to look past language, to look past access to data. And one of the ideas of GDEL is to reach to local languages, local coverage from around the world. Because, with all due respect to the New York Times, whose motto is, all the news that's fit to print, there's a whole lot more things that happen around the world each day. And the reason this becomes so powerful is, as I said, so right here you can see December 30th. So this is a graph of discussion of pneumonia worldwide. And we see all of a sudden this anomaly right here that reflects local coverage in Wuhan at the time. And you can see there's almost 2 weeks there where we're monitoring continual coverage about this from local media and then from other press. It's not till right there 2 weeks later that the rest of the world sort of wakes up and says, wow, this is a big deal. If you live in the US, you really didn't see a whole lot there. You saw just a little bit of mention here and there, but it wasn't a tier 1 story. And this graph right here really shows the importance of monitoring media around the world in local languages. So this was the 2014 Ebola outbreak. Now you can see right there, the first arrow right there, by that point the WHO had already announced it. By this point, so many people were infected, were dying, but yet in America we didn't hear anything about this. It was something on the other side of the world. And now the first Americans get it. Now it's an issue. Now we're going to talk about it. And this is one of the important things when we think about strategic communication is, it's not just looking at the press within our nation or within the nations in which we're interested in. It's about looking at the press across the entire world. And what's interesting here, though, is this bottom graph. So in journalism, for example, you're taught about America as savior. That when something bad happens around the world, America comes to the rescue is one of the sort of the tropes of U.S. journalism, and you can see that right here. So this is when the first Americans get it. The press suddenly becomes more and more positive. So the first coverage in the U.S. was, this is horrible disease. If it comes to America, we're all going to die. Really uplifting stuff. But then when the first Americans get it, it becomes more and more positive because American press said, don't worry, now that Americans have it, we're going to save us. We're going to save the world. But to be able to actually quantify this, to be able to visualize that in real time is a huge, huge leap forward. And we can do all kinds of fascinating things. We can map out events in real time. We can actually catalog things like global protests and actually watch them. So, when we talk about forecasting, we talk about predicting the future. But oftentimes it's more powerful to see the earliest glimmers, like with COVID. You could never have forecasted that would happen, but you can catch those earliest glimmers, and you have weeks and weeks, in some cases months, to be able to react to that. So these are those huge things. It's being able to catch those earliest glimmers. Or down here, the EU's asylum agency, this is a paper they published, they're actually using this to forecast where they're going to see refugee inflows, what their needs are going to be, what a lot of the causative factors are there that allows them to better prepare for that. And so again, this ability to harness, we think about the news and we think about, well, it's just telling me what's happening today. But buried within that are so many glimmers of tomorrow's biggest stories. And what's interesting is the formula of the news. So once we start thinking about news, it's not this deluge of material coming in, but when we start using machines to harness that and form that into things like actually graphs and data sets we can use, we can do things like this. We can actually come up with the mathematical models of news. And so this is, for those that are journalists, have a journalism background, it's no surprise. When something happens, like a natural disaster, a sudden onset event, you have suddenly a burst of coverage, so you get about 3 days. Then it curves down about 7 days, and then by 14 days, it's largely faded from the news. What's interesting about this is that any sudden onset event follows this formula. So when events occur and they deviate from this, that allows us to know this is no longer an organic news story. This is inorganic. And time and again, what we've been able to show with this is when we see stories that deviate from this, we can say, hey, you know what? This is no longer a story of a natural disaster. This is a story, this has become a political story about a government failing its citizenry, which is being promoted from abroad, for example. So it's a really powerful way of kind of understanding the cycles of news. We can map world events in real time. So this is by BBVA, and this is very interesting. They were mapping refugee inflows and outflows in 2015, strictly from news data from our data. What was so fascinating about this is when you went back afterwards, so governments, they were releasing this data quarterly, I think in this case. The data actually matched exactly what they were showing, but in this case it's real time, hour by hour. So the ability to see, but most importantly, with data like this, to be able to ask questions of how is the media portraying those refugees? So this is a fascinating piece that she did, where what she did is she took our data and she looked for refugees are. And then she said, what's the word that follows that? And she made a map, and this is just one little screenshot of her map. And what's fascinating is she was coding it positive or negative, and then you could see how, what were someone saying. So in this case, refugees are living at our doorsteps. So this is a really fascinating way that you can then scale up. And then what she did is she took refugees are, and then what's the next word that follows that? And then the word that follows that, and the word that follows that. And so you can start understanding frame. You can then drill down country by country, and you can say, how are they being portrayed in this country? And this is a really powerful way, because when things go wrong, when there's hardship in a society, you need a scapegoat, and oftentimes it's the people that have just arrived. So the ability to dig deeply into the media, to be able to ask these, and to go even a step further. So this was during COVID, one of the questions that was asked to us was, a consortium of governments said, we know most of the falsehoods around COVID. What are the narratives that we don't know? What are those things that we're not expecting right now? So what we did here across the 65 languages we were translating at the time, which by the way now is more than 400, what's interesting here is we're able to cluster that, we're able to show these different clusters, but then we can start looking at some of these clusters and say, well, that's interesting here. This is a new narrative that's emerging. And there's a fascinating analysis where they were actually looking at different falsehoods like the 5G, Bill Gates and Soros and mind control. And there's a fascinating analysis where they looked at each of those and they actually looked at how those were beginning to merge. So you could actually see these different falsehoods combine and form new narratives off of that, sort of like planets intersecting and spinning around. And this is incredibly powerful to be able to sort of look at that 30,000-foot view of the narratives. And to be able to look at influencers. So the thing about strategic communication is all about communicating. And so this was an example we did for CC, at carbon capture and sequestration. We just took out all the person names mentioned in a collection of 30,000 articles and just drew lines between them if they appeared in an article together. And the end result was you got this clustering of, for example, the pro-solar industry or pro-solar community in, say, Australia, or the anti-wind industry in another area. And what's interesting is around each of those peripheries are the journalists and the Wall Street analysts and the others that drive the conversation in that area. So essentially, this is sort of the world's ultimate influencer guide, but generated in real time, and you can drill that down. You can say, I want the people that cover this in a positive light, or a negative light, or hype it, and be able to drill down and understand not just what's being said, but who's saying it. And this is a fascinating one. We talk about sentiment, emotion as positive, negative, but the landscape of emotion is so much deeper. So this is tracking emotion, anxiety actually, and it's from the start of COVID. You can see obviously this huge surge, but then you can see for about a month, this is English language coverage here, about a month, the world's global English language coverage was very anxious, reflecting society's concern about lockdowns and what would happen. But then something happens. Suddenly anxiety collapses. Societies had not unlocked by that point. What had happened was societies themselves had just decided they were done with this. They weren't scared. They weren't worried about COVID anymore. Governments, however, acted as if that was continuing. So that is that moment then where you really start seeing all these fights happening between societies and their governments. So the ability to see things like this at scale and then know, hey, at this point, we've got to change the way we're communicating this. And then being able to do things like mapping global happiness. So this is a fascinating map, by the way. So this is not how happy or sad people are. What this is you take every mention of Paris today, across the world. How positive or negative was that mention? And what this shows you is not how people feel within each country, it's how the world portrays those countries. And this again reminds us, wherever we live around the world, the lenses to which we see. We're seeing the world through the lens of media in most cases. And to understand that lens may only be feeding us negative news from some areas and only positive news from other areas. And to think about that. And this is a map actually of global tone, positive, negative, 1979 to 2010, around the world. And you notice there's some ups and downs, but you notice something remarkable happens in the late 90s. That was the rise of the web. And you can notice everything becomes steadily more negative after that. And what this shows us is with the rise of the web, so social media oftentimes is blamed for all this negativity, but to see it was actually the rise of the web, because all of a sudden news outlets now are competing with each other from around the world. And so suddenly, negative news sells. So there was this race to the bottom. And this continues, by the way. And what this tells us is that more and more, the world may or may not have changed. We talk about how dark the world is getting. The world may actually be the same as it always is, but the news media is focusing more and more on the negatives. But of course, video is everywhere today. We increasingly consume news. If we see something happening, we don't tweet, we don't write about it, we take a photograph or video of it. So how do we analyze that? And so collaboration with the Internet Archives, Television News Archive, we actually are processing 5 million broadcasts from over 50 countries, standing back portions of 20 years, and asking how can machines and humans together help us understand? So this is actually 1 hour of television from 30 different stations. And you can actually see how different the world's narratives are, how different what we're seeing around the world. It's interesting too, because in some countries you'll see science and technology. There's an hour of it every day, and it's positive. They're talking about the possibilities. In the US, the only science and technology news we tend to see is, social media is destroying us and AI is going to kill us all. And so to think about, what does that mean? What you're never communicating to a vacuum. You're communicating into a landscape. And one of the things that we're looking at is, again, I speak English, a little bit of Estonian as well. So I don't speak Russian. So if I want to understand Russian television news, how can machines help with that? So this is some work that we're doing right now with television, where we're using live transcription and live translation to take television news and in real time. Now again, this is things that have been done for a long time now. What we're doing is demonstrating at scale in new forms of interface that really begin to, now again, machine translation is far from perfect, but it's good enough that I can get a general gist and understand for myself. If someone tweets and says, oh my God, you've got to see what was just on an hour ago, I can go and say, yeah, that was there, but that was pulled way out of context. And so that's a huge thing for us, is being able to understand, to be able to use machines to help us with this. Similarly, there's a lot of text on television. So this was a question for social media. When Donald Trump, Twitter at one point began labeling his tweets and saying this is false or questioned. What we were able to show is he learned this. And so by scanning, what we did is we scanned American television news for any of his tweets that appeared on screen. And we looked at the timing of those. And what we found was when Twitter started labeling his tweets, the moment that he would tweet, so he recognized this, so he would tweet something and then Twitter would flag it, and now all of a sudden it's front page in the news for the next 3 days. Then it would calm down, he'd tweet something else to generate another burst of coverage. So the ability of politicians to learn the cycle, something that was designed to be helpful, to flag falsehoods, suddenly became actually, and this is the big thing when you think about countering narratives, this was something that was supposed to decrease visibility, and instead it drove visibility of his narratives. Now these are graphs that most of you probably haven't seen. So in the aftermath of Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, a lot of people are asking what's happening to Twitter. So this top graph right here is total volume of daily tweets since 2012. And we can see right there towards the end is Elon Musk's purchase. So contrary to what you've been hearing in the news, Twitter is far from dying. In fact, now yes, it's hemorrhaging employees, it's hemorrhaging advertisers. But in terms of tweets per day, its user base are tweeting on like nothing's happening. Down here in the lower left, this is the average and the median age of accounts. And what this tells us is there's no huge influx or outflux of users. The same users that have always been there are tweeting just like they always have. This is huge, but this graph down here, this is the percentage of tweets that are retweets, replies, and mentions. What it tells us is Twitter's becoming an echo chamber. Half of the tweets every day are retweets. 10% of all tweets are either sent by a verified user or retweeted, or one of their tweets retweeted. In other words, a handful of elites are basically driving the narrative on Twitter. And that has these huge implications if we think about, what are the insights that we're hearing. You don't go to, when we talk about Twitter, a lot of times we analyze Twitter because it's easy to analyze. There's a lot of tools for it. But what you're hearing on Twitter is not from ordinary people. You're hearing from elites. Now going back to television, one of the most important things is the visual narratives. It's not what's said, it's the visuals there. If I talk about inflation in the US, is it gas prices? Is it small businesses? Is it, what is the imagery that's being used to convey it to the public? So one of the things that we're looking at is how can we use machines to help us with this? So using machines to scan all this television news and annotate it. But machines are really good at telling us what's on the screen. What they're not as good at is telling us why. So in the early days of the pandemic, about a month into the pandemic, this was the end of last, the early one, this is maybe April or May of the pandemic, we asked, what's different about television news right now compared to pre-pandemic? And the first thing the machine said was bookcases. They're everywhere. Now, a machine can tell, hey, you know what, I'm seeing these bookcases everywhere. But of interest, I'm seeing it BBC News and MSNBC. I'm not seeing it on CNN or Fox News. What the machine does not know is why are all those bookcases there all of a sudden? You can see this graph here. They all appear magically right as lockdowns occur and everyone's filming from home. And that's because in the US, a bookcase is sort of shorthand for expert, scholar, authoritativeness. And so this is interesting that essentially all across the board, every politician, every talking head, every person that showed up on television news found whatever pile of books was in their house and put it behind their head. But this is huge because machines can tell us that this is happening, but they can't tell us why it's happening. And so this is why the human and the machine together is such a powerful combination, because machines can sift through petabytes of video. They can sift through 5 million broadcasts, and they can tell us patterns like this, that a human then can dive into, why am I seeing this? And finally, one of the most interesting things now is we have AI tools today where you can actually ask for, I want a soldier in front of the Russian flag, and it can actually find that. And it can actually give us, you can actually describe scenes, and machines can actually find that for you and give that to you. And this is really the future of visual search. It's not keyword search of spoken word. It's not a keyword search of the web. It's complicated visual searches that allow us to see, like, where are these narratives showing up? And conversely, then the machine can start telling us, not just bookcases are everywhere, but I'm seeing bookcases in a particular context. And so in the end, it's really this idea, this is a famous quote from Isaac Asimov, and my work is oftentimes likened to psychohistory, because it's about scooping up the world's information. Because you think about it, as strategic communicators, if I say, hey, here is hundreds of petabytes of news, that's not useful to you. What you need are the final insights from that, the things that tell you what you need to do next. And so in the end, it's really this idea of using massive data, massive computing power, to take these fire hoses of material that are around and transform them into simple visualizations and actionable insights that you can use to make your own decisions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.